I know if I bring up these issues, it's going to hurt and upset my parents, and I'd rather not have to deal with that. Her siblings were open to the conversation, but her parents were not. It's confusing because they're like, I know my parents love
filling
me,
in the
but they
gaps
don't
of
love
their
my
stories
people.
that their parents left behind.
Mistreating her parents when they were together.
He keeps in touch with
Her
his
mom
later
later
make
tried to
amends,
make
but
up
by
with
then
his
Allison
mother
felt he
wished
had
he
to
had
ask
to
his
ask
mother
her
about
parents.
race.
When will our stories really be ours?
I'm gonna get you. I'm gonna get you.
On April 5th, 2005, my parents, white Americans, flew across the world to China to adopt me. Growing up, although I understood that I was an East Asian woman being raised by a white family, I struggled to find a comfortable racial identity. At school, I was told that I was basically white by other Asian students, but seen and treated as Chinese by my white peers. I remember always feeling as if I was both not Asian enough and too Asian at the same time. After I started researching for this documentary, I realized that I was not the only adoptee to struggle with their racial identity. In fact, this experience is so common that many scholars studying transracial adoptions, including Dr. Richard Lee, a professor of communications at the University of Minnesota, have coined the term the transracial adoptive paradox to describe growing up with white privilege as a non-white person. Lee argues that limiting conversations to cultural celebrations and discussions about heritage rather than more complex topics such as systematic racism and the lingering impacts of colonialism often leads to transracial adoptees facing a jarring confrontation with their race and the racism of others later in life. As I read Lee's work, I wondered why transracial adoptees continue to struggle with their racial identities and if news media contributes to this lack of social progress. I began by reading Anissa Joy Leonard's journal article, Transracial Adoption as Continued Oppression, Modern Practice and Context, which is featured in a 2022 edition of the Columbia University Social Work Review. Leonard explains that from the orphan train to native residential schools, non-white orphans have been mistreated and commodified since the 1800s. The New York Children's Aid Society, which gained the popular nickname the Orphan Train, was started by Charles Loring Brace in 1854. Over the course of 70 years, around 200,000 children in eastern cities were placed with agricultural families in the Midwest. The majority of the children were Irish or Italian, ethnic groups which were considered non-white at the time and practicing Catholics, but they were often placed with American Protestant families who forced them to conform and convert. As the era of the orphan train came to an end, around the 1860s, residential schools for indigenous children gained popularity. These schools abused abducted Native children into assimilating into American culture, and when the children left the schools, most were adopted by white families, never to see their parents again. A century later, during the 1850s and 60s, there were very few white children up for adoption in the United States. To remedy this, the Bureau of Indian Affairs enacted the Indian Adoption Project. From 1958 to 1967, around 700 indigenous children from the western United States were forcibly removed and given to white families in the East. Although the project officially ended in 1967, placing Native children with white families remained a popular practice for another decade. Although some progress has been made in today's adoption system, commodification of non-white children and prioritizing parental interests is still a huge issue. According to Leonard, in 2019, 28% of adoptions from foster carers in the United States were transracial, a 22% increase from 2005. This increase is partially due to the difficulties that many non-white families face when adopting in the United States. The Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, or the MEPA, which was passed in 1994, also contributed to this spike in transracial adoptions. This act bars adoption agencies from refusing placements based on the race, nationality, or ethnicity of the adoptee or the adopters, effectively establishing a colorblind stance. Unfortunately, while this act does encourage the adoption of non-white children by white parents, Leonard explains that a racial hierarchy that posits blackness at the bottom still affects transracial adoptions, with white adoptive parents desiring children who are proximal to whiteness. Foreign adoptions have an added appeal to some white parents who use their child's foreignness to incorrectly perceive them as raceless and thus closer to white. The commodification of non-white children has become so drastic that adoption agencies have now begun listing racial and ethnic percentages for orphans as the demand for multiracial children grows exponentially. Armed with a better understanding of the history and the current state of transracial adoption, I began to explore news media coverage of, and thus effect on, adoptees. In 2 journal articles published in Adoption Quarterly in 2001 and 2002 respectively, Catherine Creedy discusses how the sensationalization of adoption in journalism perpetuates negative societal myths around adoption. In her 2001 article, Journalists Tackle Accuracy in Adoption Reporting, Creedy explains that journalists often unnecessarily include the detail that a person was adopted, thus promoting the idea that adoptive families are less genuine or permanent than traditional families, as the adoptee remains an other throughout their life. Creedy further explores journalists' exploitation of adoption a year later in her article, Rush to Judgment. Media's coverage still indicates much work ahead in normalizing adoption. The message that adoption is problematic is certainly confirmed every time a newspaper gratuitously mentions a person is adopted, regardless of relevance to the story, Creedy says. Creedy's article helped me understand news media's reporting on adoptions in the early 2000s, but I still wanted to know how journalists do or do not enforce the continued commodification of non-white orphans. I chose to analyze articles from 4 large American newsrooms: The Guardian, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and BBC News. While all 4 articles provided relevant statistics, data, and background information about the historical and current struggles of transracial adoption, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and BBC News all blatantly ignored the adoptees' stories and instead focused on the adoptees' parents. In the 2021 Washington Post article, I Know My Parents Love Me, But They Don't Love My People, Rachel Hatzipanagos shares 6 unique transracial adoption stories and examines the negative impacts transracial adoption can have on children. Although this article should revolve around the adoptees' lives and racial identities, instead, Hatzipanagos inadvertently blames and chastises the adoptive parents, exploiting transracial adoptees with her content as much as she does with her title. Likewise, Janae Desmond Harris's New York Times opinion piece, Should I Try and Save a Child from Her Adoptive Mom's Bad Politics, questions if white parents are capable of raising non-white children. Arguing over which outside party is worthy of raising a non-white child not only commodifies non-white orphans, but silences them in a discussion about their own racial identity. Desmond Harris discusses if outsiders are entitled to impose their personal beliefs on adoptive parents rather than the adoptee's journey with accepting her racial identity. Although the 2020 BBC News article, Transracial Adoption, I've Been Accused of Kidnapping My White Child, by Megha Mohan, does not blame adoptive parents for their children's struggles with their racial identities, it still examines the effects of transracial adoption on parents rather than adoptees. By subtly blaming the adoptive parents, the Washington Post and the New York Times shift the narrative focus and silence adoptees whose stories are supposedly being told. I was disheartened after having analyzed the first 3 articles, as it appeared very little progress had been made to improve the accuracy of adoption reporting since 2002 when Creedy published Rush to Judgment. However, as I read my final article, Nicole Chung's Stories of Transracial Adoptees Must Be Heard, Even Uncomfortable Ones, which was published in The Guardian in 2019, I quickly noticed an important distinction between Chung's article and the others. Chung herself is a transracial adoptee. As a result, Chung does not include any sensationalizing rhetoric as the other journalists do. Instead of flashy details and a heavy focus on the parents, she argues that non-white adoptees should be allowed to tell their own stories, even when they don't have a happy ending. Chung explains that non-white adoptees are often seen as more palatable to white parents, and transracial adoption is seen as an antidote for racism based on the notion that love conquers all. According to Chung, as a result of these lofty expectations for non-white adoptees, the unhappy adoptee trope, which parallels the angry person of color trope, has emerged. Both of these tropes enforce the expectations that non-white people must be good and excuse racism, placing white comfort over their own humanity. The exploitation of transracial adoptees and the narrative focus on the parents over the children in journalism enforces a system that has historically silenced and commodified non-white orphans. Non-white adoptees must have control and be the center of their own stories, even when they do not enforce the narrative that transracial adoption is an easy, painless solution to racism. Although there has been some decrease in the exploitation of adoptees in news media since 2002, when Rush to Judgment was published, unfortunately, the fact remains that adoption is curious and, for that reason, it makes good copy, on television, in the news, and over the back fence.
Lives forever.
News media must stop exploiting and silencing non-white adoptees so that all non-traditional families, not just families with transracial adoptees, can be accepted by society. So that the number of newborns killed each year during secret births begin to fall. And so that the hundreds and thousands of children still in the system can find safe and loving homes. If journalists truly desire to correct a racist system that continues to silence and commodify non-white people, they must disregard their flashy headlines and treat non-white adoptees' stories as what they are. Ours.
Without his lifelong friend, Puff could not be brave. So Puff, that mighty dragon, sadly slipped into his cave. Oh, Puff, the magic dragon, lived by the sea and frolicked in the autumn mist in a land called Honolulu. Puff, the magic dragon, lived by the sea and frolicked in the autumn mist in a land called Honolulu.